Okay, whenever the, ready?
People are handicapping that as a close race, though. I don't.
I know, it's true. So here we are at a continuation of the Board of Selectmen of Wenham's meeting of Tuesday, September 18th. We began at 5:30 with an executive session, which has been completed, and we are now going to begin our open session with, I will say it because it's on the agenda, with the same way that we always open our open sessions, and that is with input on items that are not on the agenda from anyone in our vast audience. But I don't see anyone, so we'll pass that. The next thing that we have is, under new business, a discussion and approval of modified compensation and classification schedule for non-union employees. Before we get to that, let me just say we have two selectmen here tonight. Our third selectman, John Clemenzi, is unable to join us tonight because he's not feeling well. So, Peter, would you like to summarize this, or would you like me to?
Yeah, no, I can do that. So, one change and one addition, I guess, to our compensation and classification schedule for non-union employees. The first addition is adding the inspector of buildings position as a grade 7, which is where, based on the external and internal comps, we had slotted that position. That's again the shared new building inspector position with Hamilton, and good news to report there. Brian Leith began work yesterday, and he reported again today.
I saw him in your office today. I thought it was a good sign.
Yeah,
he was here.
So things are going well. They all kidding aside, they had a joint meeting with the folks in Hamilton and in Wenham and the new inspectors yesterday afternoon, and so that's off to a good start. So that's the one new addition, and then the other is we had an agenda item under executive session, another under open session under appointments for our new finance director, treasurer, collector, and that position, in going through the matrix of job function and responsibilities for all the non-union positions that determines grade, realized that the finance director position should be graded at a 3 instead of a 4. That is also, so that's from an internal equity perspective. Externally, certainly the data supports funding this position at that level as well. And so the new salary range at a 40-hour-a-week position, which is what it is now, is just over $87,000 at the low end, up to just over $109,000 on the high end. And so those are the two changes that are proposed tonight.
So I'll make a motion, and then we can discuss anything that we like. I move to adopt the updated compensation and classification system for Town of Wenham non-union employees, including the addition of the inspector of buildings at grade 7 and reclassifying the finance director, treasurer, collector as grade 3.
Second?
Anything else? I completely agree with those changes. Well, one change, one addition. I have no further questions or discussions.
And we, just as kind of a side note, we have made a few additions to where a few positions are graded and what the salary ranges are, and would suggest probably as we work through the budget process for FY20, it might make some sense. The original schedule was adopted, if you can believe it, almost 3 years ago now. And so just to ensure that we're keeping current with the market and that, we're equitable internally as well, I think it might be a good idea to do a refresh and gather some updated compensation data, just so that we're sure that we're where we need to be, which was the point originally of adopting the schedule.
And probably true moving forward, periodically. This shouldn't ever be stagnant more than 2 or 3 years. I think we should be, I don't know at what time frame, but certainly every 3 years we should be looking at it. And it's meant to be a guideline, so to your point, people have moved, dollars should certainly move to reflect current market.
Yeah, and what's happened over the past year or so is there have been a number of contract negotiations that have prompted some additional research into especially the external comps. And so that's what has led to those changes, but I think it makes sense from a fairness perspective to do that across the board for all the positions.
Great, I agree. More, anything else? If not, all in favor? Aye, that would be unanimous. We have one, let's see, we have 2 appointments this evening. I will read the motions and see where we go. The first one is, we actually have 2 openings on the Community Preservation Committee. So I move to appoint Thomas Starr and Natalie Bowers to the Community Preservation Committee for 2-year terms at large, which are the positions we appoint, beginning on September 18th, 2018, and ending on June 30th, 2020. Is there a second?
I'll second that, but I have a comment. So I thought they're not all, we have 4 positions that are at large and we get to appoint. Are they all 2-year terms? I thought one of them was a 3-year term at least, because I think Harry Davis is a 3-year term.
I think last year, Harriet, or 2 years ago, we made a change at town meeting where we did stagger the terms.
Yes.
So we have maybe 2 years and 2 3 years.
Okay.
I'd have to go back and look, but I do remember that.
The initial terms were staggered.
Right.
But now going forward, they're 2-year terms.
I see.
They're all 2-year.
I see. I got it.
All of the at-large ones, or all of them?
I believe
Feel
all
all
of
of
the
them.
at-large.
So we have
But-
2. We have 2 appointments that we have 2 members are still there. So one of them comes up next year. Apparently, well, that doesn't make sense.
No, you know what I think?
That
Well,
doesn't fit.
Yep.
So that because there's 2 other at-large members, if there are 2-year terms, and we appoint them for 2-year terms next year, then there would be 1 year we appoint 2, another year we appoint 2, and the 3rd year we appoint nobody. Or is that,
Nope, so,
I get it, okay. So every 2 years, we appoint 2 people.
Right.
As, on an ongoing basis.
every year you appoint 2 people.
Every year.
Right.
What did I say? Okay.
Correct.
Right.
Yes, right.
For
okay.
the at-large.
I'm fine.
Originally, there was a phasing in
That
of the
confused me.
terms,
So,
but
okay, I got it.
Okay.
And we should research, well, it doesn't, we can't do anything about it. What are the terms of the people, like the 5 people who are appointed by the various town committees? Are they 2-year terms or 3-year terms?
I feel
let's
like,
not guess.
yeah,
We can just look at that.
let's check.
Yeah,
It
it's in the
recently
bylaws.
changed.
Yeah.
Because it was,
Well, it should,
Harriet suggested a change,
Yep.
which was a change in the
They all should be
bylaws.
the same, but if they're not, well, nothing we can do about it. I'm just curious what
No.
they are.
My
I thought it
understanding,
was 3-year terms on the appointed,
I did too.
board appointees, but
I mean, I
whatever.
suppose we could find out quickly enough. We have a town clerk nearby, but I'm pretty confident that these 2 are 2-year terms beginning.
So I second it and I have no comments.
Okay, so all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Unanimous on that. And we have one more appointment, a very important one. I'll make this motion. I think we've talked about it enough. This was the topic of our executive session, which we are now going to vote in open session. I move to approve an employment agreement with Patricia Moore to serve as the town's finance director and treasurer collector for a 3-year term commencing September 21st, 2018, an initial probationary period through June 30th, 2019, and at an annual salary of $95,000 for FY19, and further, to appoint Patricia Moore as Finance Director/Treasurer-Collector for a term beginning November 1, 2018, and ending June 30th, 2019.
I'll second that with enthusiasm and gratitude.
Yes. And that would be my comment as well. Very enthusiastic, very happy. Glad to see that you're coming on a, sort of as-needed basis early on. Because, as much time
Let's finish this up
as you
quick, the
can.
press is here.
That's what I said, is it safe to come in?
Yeah, it is. We finished our executive session, and we are just getting ready to vote on whether or to appoint Patricia. Patty. Do you prefer Patty?
Yeah.
Okay. officially Patricia Moore, and I think we have a second?
Seconded.
Okay, I couldn't remember.
There you go.
And you had no further discussion, so all in favor?
Aye.
Aye, enthusiastically as well, it's
Congratulations.
Looking
unanimous.
forward to joining.
Great, thank you. We're looking
So are
forward
we.
to you joining us as well. The next thing on the agenda is actually yours, Jack, the overview of,
Yes, I read Peter's memo, and we had a discussion, and he sent an email around yesterday afternoon,
Earlier this morning.
early this morning.
I just felt like it was a
It
long
goes
day.
into, I think I read it twice, just to make sure. This agenda is a result of our lengthy discussion last week on emergency management with Hurricane Florence, now Tropical Storm Florence, going through
This afternoon.
raining cats and dogs, and that,
Yeah.
I mean, that was a lot of rain. So the concern that I think both John and I expressed, and Catherine as well, that whether it's this next year at this time or even next 2 weeks, another hurricane or certainly a nor'easter or something like that, what capacity do we have to shelter people if we're out of electricity and we have declared an emergency, if somebody does, and that it wasn't clear. And what Peter is basically telling us is that it's still not clear, and that we need a further discussion about this. There is some capacity at the Bucher School, Center School, but more research has to be done on that. There is some capacity here at the fire station for, I'll call it, quote-unquote, a limited number of people, but I think that we need a little more research on what our generator capacity is exactly for that. But I think the town needs to basically make sure that it can accommodate substantial, I don't know what substantial really means, but expanded limited number of people in some type of a disaster, whether it's a hurricane or a nor'easter that I remember many years ago that we were out of luck for about 4 or 5 days with a heavy nor'easter, so that we have to be able to convince ourselves that we've done everything we can to provide emergency resources in the likely event that it will eventually be needed to do so. And that this is a work in progress. I think that's fair to say, right, Peter?
Yep,
And that more work on this, and I think that all 3 selectmen believe this is a high priority to address, because we're going to have egg on our faces if we don't, well, I don't know, that we thought we had. So we have to have something that we're satisfied with that provides sufficient emergency resources. That includes more than just an emergency generator in place to have cots, food resources, which I think we have, and other things. And so I think we need to have something that we can articulate to ourselves and share with the town. And this is simply, Peter gave us an interim report, which is a preliminary report. It was not even an interim report. And next time we have this conversation on the agenda item, I believe the police chief will be here, and to basically expand upon what you want to make some comments?
Yeah, police chief, fire chief, board of health, all, have different responsibilities in terms of emergency management generally, both on the planning side and then operationally. We have had the portable generator. The fire department secured that through grant funding over 10 years ago now. The Bucher School at the time was wired up to be able to be powered by that generator. That has been our default emergency shelter on paper, although to my knowledge we haven't actually ever had to use it. Back last fall, when you remember we had that major wind and rain storm, brought a lot of trees down, a lot of power out across the town right before Halloween. We had offered the fire station to be used as a shelter, but that is definitely a short-term fix. And obviously if we have an incident anywhere on the scale of what unfortunately happened in Lawrence and North Andover and Andover over the past week, you're talking about a much broader set of resources that would...
Well, that would overwhelm us, overwhelm any small community, but nevertheless, that I think that, I'm not going to repeat all my comments, but we need to have a plan that we can look ourselves in the mirror and say, we've done as best we can, particularly with the advent of these emergency generators that are affordable now, and that they're hardwired, and that I don't know what exactly, what do you think the capacity of the, you told me, but I was surprised at the number you gave me, of the fire station. I thought you told me 70. That seems like a higher number of
The
people.
fire chief represented to me upstairs, they have a pretty significant
Oh, that's
training
right.
room.
That's right, that's
That
right.
used to actually be, when it was both fire and police, the
That's where
fire
they-
offices were in the closet upstairs up there.
That's where they would hang out, that's right.
But the fire chief represented to me that they could hold 50 or 75 people on a very short-term basis. That felt a little high.
It sounds a little high to me, too.
But
But 40 to 50 sounds more realistic. Anyway.
yeah, I mean, obviously the schools, as we talked about last week, felt like installing a hardwired generator as a solution for the Bucher School was important. They had it as a $40,000 item in their large capital project debt exclusion last year that wasn't approved. Reached out to the administration in the past week. It's still on their priority list, and so I think it would be helpful once we have a little more information in the next few weeks, potentially to have this on our agenda when we meet with them in November, so there can be coordination, because I know there were some questions that came up on the Hamilton side in
Right.
terms of why they would be, Hamilton residents would be subsidizing an emergent, funding to provide emergency shelter for Wenham residents, and I think there's a way to work through that.
Well, there is a way to work through it, but on the other hand, if there's an emergency generator at the Bucher School, wouldn't Hamiltonians feel they have a right to actually use that as well? I would if I was a
Well, I
Hamiltonian.
think they would, and I also think that generator, the proposal for that generator was meant to also help with their IT systems should the power go down. So it was not only for.
I see.
So there were some specific school uses for the center building and the Bucher, as well as for use as a shelter. So and
The
then
fact
there
that it
were
was for the
questions
center
and-
school building kind of got lost in the mix too.
Yes.
Because obviously that's where the administrative offices are, and they've got a lot of
So
resources.
more to come on this, right?
Yeah.
And I think, I agree with Jack. I think what we have is, our folks are safe. We do need to look at it as in a more comprehensive way, probably. But realistically, I don't think we should be looking at a long-term solution for shelter.
Right.
Because as we saw in Lawrence, and people didn't go to the shelters for more than overnight or a day or two. It's not like, but they're going to be without gas probably for 4 weeks or however months.
And having
So-
dealt with a similar public safety, public health emergency, when I worked in another municipality, we were housing people in hotels.
Yeah.
I mean, that realistically for the, when you get beyond 24, 48 hours, that's really what you're
I think we
gonna
need a list of
think
all the
that's
Wenham
what-
Hotel, excuse me, right in.
Well, I think the reality is, unless you can't get through, the reality of it, as it has happened in the past with extended power outages, is that people leave town. They go to family members, or they go themselves, the type of communities that we have, they go to a hotel.
If we have a nor'easter, though, it's going to be area-wide.
Oh, I agree.
There was,
I agree.
was it
I-
25
doesn't-
years ago, we were out of power for like 4 days.
Right.
So we're looking for something, not a long-term like
Right,
they've
but that's my only
experiencing
point.
through in the North Andover and Andover. We're looking for something, a 3 to 5 day situation
Right.
where we have a nor'easter that trees it down every place, there's no electricity, et cetera, so that some places they get warm, and that there's coffee and whatever, and that some...
Right.
Right.
They have a bigger building.
And my understanding is that historically, in talking to the chiefs a little bit more about this, our emergency shelter up until 10, 12 years ago was the high school.
Was the high school?
Yes.
Well, they have better memories than me, but I don't doubt their memories.
That was, again, I don't know if it
Well, the
was anything
biggest.
that was ever enacted, but they have hardwired generator, obviously just more capacity
Right.
there.
Right.
I may be misremembering this, but there was a Mother's Day storm. I had to evacuate my house and go to, it's now some tech company, but
Yes.
it wasn't a hotel, what do you call it?
It was,
on Route 128
Yes.
there,
Yes.
The King's Grant.
King's Grant Inn. I had to go there, and I was lucky to get in.
Yeah, that's true. There have been a couple times I've had
$5
to leave. But
$5
I
a
think
night
that's
was
what people
expensive,
have tried to do, if possible. Anyway, so more to come
Definitely more to
on
come.
that.
Yep.
Okay. The last, that is the last item. We have no other matters that I can reasonably anticipate unless, Jack, do you have any other reasonably
I
anticipated
can't
items?
reasonably anticipate anything you haven't already reasonably anticipated.
Okay, so I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, unanimous. And we're going to take a 10-minute break, recess, and then we will start up again with our Finance Committee in place. Is that right? Is it 6:30? Does it
Yep,
start at
6:30.
To have a presentation on the FY20 budget forecast, so. Well, I should ask Patty if she wants. Okay, we're ready.
All right, call the FinCom to order.
And we are here tonight to hear a presentation on, a preliminary presentation on on a budget forecast for FY20, given to us by our town administrator, Peter Lombardi. Take it away, Peter.
Okay, so welcome everyone. This is the fourth time through that we've done our 5-year budget forecast, starting off our budget building process a little later than we've done it the past couple of years. This time we're kind of back to our more standard schedule, which is kicking things off after Labor Day, and over the next few months we'll be working with department heads on their initial submissions, and we can kind of talk about the schedule a little later on in the process. But the format should look remarkably similar. No need to change something that seems to have worked for us, just in terms of going through our budget situation at a high level before we begin work with the department heads. So just basically walking through what the presentation is going to cover. We're going to start with a recap of the FY19 budget. Not that we need to spend too much time on that. I feel like we obviously spent many, many months on that not so long ago at this point, but just a little refresher to reorient. And then we'll go into some of the detail specifically about FY20 that is in the budget forecast. And there's the two documents, there's the PowerPoint, and then everybody should also have the detail sheet that shows FY16 to 19 budgets, FY20 projected, and then 21 to 24 projected as well. And then really we're going to talk about, based on where the initial projections come in specific to FY20, what that means for us in terms of budget guidelines and our process over the next several months. So for FY19's budget, it was, as you all know, a level services budget. There was a 2% cost of living adjustment. We were in the third year of all three of our collective bargaining agreements with Fire, Police, and AFSCME, and so that was the wage precedent in those contracts, and also what was applied to non-union employees as well. There were contractual step increases that were included, obviously, in that budget, and then the 2% merit pay maximum ceiling for non-union employees. On the revenue side, we assumed static new growth, so $100,000, as I believe both the Board of Selectmen and the Finance Committee know now, our new growth actuals for FY for the last fiscal year came in much higher than projected, which is going to create some additional capacity going forward, which is going to help us hopefully deliver a balanced budget for FY20. But the $100,000 was what we had projected for the current fiscal year. And then we had a modest increase in our local receipts, total of $203,000, most of which, almost half of which, was for the shared inspectional service model that is live now, and that's offset. Essentially, it's revenue neutral. It's offset on the expense side, so it looked like a larger increase in local receipts than it actually was. We did program in conservatively out of the gate $35,000 for this fiscal year for the fire-based EMS pilot program that started last March, and there will be in the next few Board of Selectmen's meetings, there'll be an update from the fire chief relative to how that program's going, what we're seeing in terms of revenues, but generally we knew that was a conservative number. It likely will come in a little higher than that, and we can talk in a few slides out about what I'm projecting going forward for FY20 for those revenues. And then there were just a few other really incremental adjustments that were made in local receipts, motor vehicle excise, and the like. And again, we relied on the $750,000 in free cash to build that operating budget. In terms of capital, we funded just over $250,000 in capital using free cash, just over $200,000 in free cash, and $55,000 from the water surplus for the new water pickup truck. And that's been consistent the year prior for FY18. Town meeting approved somewhere on the order of $140,000, $150,000 in capital from free cash. And then we actually used some other one-time revenue sources for some other capital needs back in FY18. So the major budget driver, as we all know, was the school district, and that the net operating increase, so the gross increase was 5.4%, the net was 6.9%, and our assessment went up 9.2%. And that was largely driven by the enrollment shift. And so basically we had no levy capacity. There was a debt exclusion that was approved at town meeting, was approved at the ballot of just over $330,000, and has now been permanently added to our levy going forward. So our tax rate increased from 1879. It's estimated at 1980. We'll know in the next few months once we complete the recap process and valuations are updated, exactly what that number is going to be. But that was what we had projected when we went to town meeting, and 42 cents per thousand of that increase was for the operating override.
But you weren't sure whether how much that would cause a surplus, if any?
What's that?
But you weren't sure with the last one. And I don't remember. Did it still create a surplus for us, or just pretty much break even?
No, so the operating override just covered exactly how much the difference was and what our assessment was to cover the full school funded budget. So for FY20, it depends on, obviously there are some contractual obligations that are already in place on the expense side. So it depended on which department, but generally we used anywhere from a 0 to a 1.5% increase on the expense side. For the personnel line items, again, depending on the department and the personnel within that department, those increased by 2 at the low end, 4% on the high end. That 4% captures step increases for the library employees and maximum merit increases of the 2% for non-union employees. It's right now a placeholder of a 2% COLA. We will in the next month or so begin contract negotiations for the expiring union contracts that expire June 30. So obviously that's a little bit of a moving target, but just for the purposes of looking at the forecast, 2% is what the wage precedent has been for 17 and 18, and so, I'm sorry, for 18 and 19, and so we kept it at that for 20 for now. Pension obligations, we've generally seen between 8 and 10%. 10% was an all-time high a couple of years ago. So we plugged in 9% for next year at this point. And we obviously, as we go along through the budget process, we'll have more certainty around that number. But I think that's a pretty fair number to assume, plus or minus a percentage point, just based on what the Essex Regional Retirement Board has adopted for a pension schedule. For health insurance, as you remember, we opted out of the GIC. Last year, went to Harvard Pilgrim. We'll be going out to market for FY20. So it's a little different process than we're used to historically, where we were just kind of waiting and wishing and hoping with the state. We never knew. We always had to just put a placeholder because they never communicated what that percentage increase was going to be early enough for us to incorporate it into our budget. So we were traditionally pretty conservative, and we really didn't have any control over it. It's going to be obviously much different this year because there are going to be other factors outside of the premiums that will be on the table, and the Public Employee Committee will be statutorily directly involved in that negotiating process. We have a third-party consultant who helped us opting out of the GIC, going through that process. They're still on board, and they'll be assisting the town going forward. So just, again, a placeholder for right now is a 7% increase. It's a little challenging for us because we have less than 100 employees in terms of the data tracking to project out what we might see. So just working through the preliminary conversations on that end.
Peter, who are we with? I know we left GIC.
Harvard Pilgrim.
Harvard Pilgrim, okay.
With Harvard Pilgrim.
All right. So is that different? Is it administratively different in terms of like the?
Definitely administratively different. And, you know, obviously we saw pretty significant savings depending on where the GIC ultimately ended up for FY19. It was on the order of 17–18% premium savings from where we were last year to where we would have ended up this year. So obviously that was one of the things that helped get us to where we were. But yeah, it'll definitely be a different process this time through.
I did note, somewhat related, that Mass Health went up a very modest amount this year. They were projecting 5 or 7 points, and it went up a 2 or 3 points. So, I mean, it's a good, it's in the good direction.
It's in the right direction.
For me, so.
Yeah, I mean, you know, for us, our experience, you know, because we're so small, one or two
Can throw the whole thing.
can really change the pool. We did go out, if you'll remember, we did a joint solicitation with Hamilton to see, when we initially went through this process last fall, to see if there was any value to be gained there. And actually, we were helping them more than they were helping us. So that's why we just went it alone. That being said, I think big picture, that's something that we should consider now that we're out of the GIC. That being said, it's much more complicated to have Hamilton in the mix just because they have their own unions, their own PEC, and their plan design is not the same exact as ours. So, yeah, it can get complicated quickly. In terms of capital, as I said, generally we've been on the order of $150,000, $200,000 that we funded from free cash. We have generally started off with our forecast with a placeholder of $200,000 or thereabouts as we start the budget process. And the past couple of years, we've shifted that out and paid for it with free cash because we had it available. That being said, 2 years ago, we had $1.4 million of free cash. Last year was 1.2. I think that's the direction we're going just because in trying to balance a budget, we've bumped up local receipts, still conservative, but inched them up from where they were, and at the same time have cranked down as much as we can on the expense side. So the trend should be over time for free cash to decrease. We won't know that number for another month or so, but I would not be surprised at all if our free cash was at or below $1 million for next year. Our policy is a minimum of $250,000. So for the purposes of this conversation, that $200,000 that we have over the past few years paid from free cash, I don't think it's going to be there this year. So if we're committed to our capital program, I think it's important that it's in the operating budget. The other thing to keep in mind is that of that $200,000 that was funded in free cash last year, there was actually almost $150,000 that was an ongoing cost. So year one of 2 lease agreements, the front end loader was $40,000. Year one of a 5-year lease. Year 2 is coming up next year, so that's an obligation we have. We paid for road capital half out of the operating budget, half out of free cash. That was another $45,000. And then our MS4 stormwater compliance, year one of that was $45,000 that we'd actually paid for from the previous year and encumbered because the permit didn't end up going into effect until this fiscal year. But there are, there's essentially $150,000 of capital need that isn't budgeted that will be accommodated here. So it leaves us really not that much wiggle room, just over $50,000 of other new capital needs that would be accommodated in the operating budget. And then the last is the OPEB contribution. If you'll recall, last year, 2 years ago, we used one-time funding of the $30,000. Last year, we included $40,000 in the operating budget. So that was a hit to take last year. This year, we're just increasing it by, according to our policy, $10,000 a year. So we're going from $40,000 to $50,000. So that's up $10,000. In terms of school expense, let me see where this is.
I have a question.
Yep.
On the HWRSD, oh no, I'm ready to just
okay.
On the preliminary estimated increases, is that from us or is that from the school district?
This is all from us
Okay.
because they have not even begun their budget process. And I checked with their administration and this is just our own assumptions. And this is on page 4. The detail for the schools is on page 4 of the roll-up. So let's start with Essex Tech. That's a little more straightforward. It looks like we have 3 seniors who graduated and 3 incoming freshmen. So we're assuming that nothing else is going to change in terms of enrollment. So enrollment is static. And we've just plugged in a 3% net operating increase, which is pretty consistent with what we've seen from the district over the past few years. And then there's also our debt obligations, which we bumped up slightly because there was some increased reimbursement from the MSBA for their school building project, and not clear to me at this point whether that was a one-time give back or whether that's going to be applied going forward. So that was just slightly increased back up to $20,000. On the school district, again, very preliminary, but the estimated increase is just under $600,000 in Wenham's assessment. The 3 components, this will look familiar. The enrollment shift, I think very positive news there. Only impacting our year-over-year increase, $162,000. That is about half of what we have seen each of the past 3 fiscal years. So as we were hoping, we're kind of coming down on the other side of the shift, which has really been a major decrease in Hamilton, a slight increase in Hamilton, and we can go into a little more detail about the enrollment in a few slides down, but certainly some relief from what we've been accustomed to the past few years. There was about $350,000 in excess and deficiency that was applied to reduce our assessment last year. That was a pretty significant reduction from the prior year, if you remember, where they had almost $600,000. And so for our purposes at this point, I've assumed that there's not going to be any excess and deficiency applied, which is an increase of $125,000 to our assessment. And we will, not to jump ahead too much, but we will know both the actual enrollment and the certified excess and deficiency from the schools end of October, beginning of November. So those numbers that are placeholders now will be known in about a month and a half.
Excuse me, Pete?
Yep.
What's the 579 signify in terms of percent? Did I miss that? Is it like a 3%, 5%?
So the third bullet is, it's a 3% net operating increase.
3% net op?
Yeah, so the 579 is 295 of that is the net operating increase.
Yeah.
And then there's the loss of the reduction in E&D, and then there's the enrollment shift all layered on. So it adds up to the
Oh,
579.
here it is. I'm sorry, I missed it.
Yep. And again, 3% isn't meant to be prescriptive. It's consistent with the number that we've generally used this time of year. It's consistent with the placeholder we have for Essex Tech, and just kind of generally up or down to have a point of orientation. Every 0.5% increase in the school district's net operating budget increases our assessment by $50,000. And again, just to briefly touch on the enrollment, as you will remember, we relied on the NESDEC report traditionally. We weren't entirely certain that that was a great data point based on their year-over-year changes and how consistent their projections were with their actuals. And so, excuse you. There was a lot of conversation around trying to get a better consultant who would really dig into the numbers broken out by town. We got the grant funding. Ultimately, the schools commissioned McKibben to do their report. I think everybody here was at their presentation, and everybody felt like their methodology was something that we could rely on. And so the projections for FY20 are based on that McKibben report. Interestingly, the two reports are very consistent from last year for what their projections are for this year. So it'll be interesting to see if there's a lot of difference
This year.
for this coming year. I think NESDEC had Wenham +7, exactly the same as McKibben, but they were, I think, maybe down 8 in Hamilton. So if that's the case, it's going to be a little better for us, but we'll see. Again, they're just projections. But McKibben seemed to indicate that, if I remember correctly, they hadn't completed any report and then followed up on it in the next 2 years without more than a 2% differentiation between what they projected and what the actuals were.
That's what I remember as well.
Okay, so on the revenue side for FY20, and this is your first page in the budget detail. So there is, for FY20, we have new growth increased to $200,000, and that's actually what we have projected out over the next 5 fiscal years. That's really based on 2 data points. One is the actuals for 17 and 18. Our actuals for 18 were 208,000. For 19 is going to be 475. We know a lot of that's measure and list. About $250,000 of that is measure and list, but that still brings in new growth outside of that project in well over $200,000, and that was really before the 2 major subdivisions started coming online. So we have Spring Hill, Wenham Pines, both of which will continue to increase valuation and create new growth. So we've used $200,000 right now as a placeholder for next year, and that's, again, independent of the increases that we saw from the Measure and List project. Local receipts are up a little over 5%, and a majority of that increase, essentially half of that increase in local receipts, is increasing our EMS revenues from the $35,000 that we projected for this year to $100,000 for FY20. It's a pilot program. We certainly haven't made any policy determination on whether we're going to continue with it. The pilot program wraps up technically in March, but I think we all know that in order to budget appropriately for FY20, we need to know probably a few months before that whether we're going to continue with it or not. And yeah, there'll be a full presentation on the financials that we've seen to date. Originally, we had projected between $175,000 to $200,000 on the revenue side, and I think that's probably not going to be that far off from what we've seen so far. Obviously, the way the billing works, it takes a good amount of time from when you go live to when you actually have the checks in hand. So we're really just starting to see that over the past 2 months or so. But we know what we've built out, and so I think increasing it to $100,000 is a fair number and not taking off more than
Lag about 2-3 months.
What's that?
Is a lag about 2-3 months?
On when, yeah, it can be, I'd say 2 months is ideal. It's generally closer to 4, but you know, we really haven't increased much at all on the expense side, and there'll be more on that, I would imagine, too, as we go through the contract negotiation process with the fire union in particular.
Peter?
Yep.
Just a general request for the future. We've talked a couple of times in your notes about actuals, how we compare to actuals, but everything on the detail is budget. I would be interested at some point in time, maybe not back to FY16,
Yeah.
but at some point in time to see actuals
Yep.
as well as budgets, because I feel like that's a data point that might be useful for us to know going forward.
Yep.
How's our budgeting doing versus our actuals?
Definitely.
Thank you.
So Peter, the 35,000 for FY19 for the ambulance service, that was about 3-ish months?
Oh, that
during the
was
season, is that-
18.
Oh, that was a year prior.
No,
Yeah.
when we originally programmed that number in, we thought we were going to go live earlier with the pilot program. So we thought at most we would have 6 months of
6
revenue.
months, yeah.
And so then we were saying, okay, maybe we'll see 75,000, so you cut it in half, and that's where we ended up at 35. Again, we didn't want to rely on it. It was such an unknown at that
Yeah.
point. We hadn't even launched the program, and so it was really just a modest placeholder to really get us to where we were. So yeah, no, that was the genesis behind it. So state aid is assumed to be level. If you look, we actually have really been treading water on that for the past few
Stable.
years. You know,
$10,000 here or there.
yeah, we saw a tick up from where we were in you know, as Catherine mentioned, $10,000 here or there. But generally, big picture, it's a very, very small percentage of our budget, and we've assumed that it's going to remain at that level.
Safe assumption, I think.
So on free cash, as I touched on earlier, I expect our free cash balances to be coming down from where they were a few years ago. And so realistically, I don't think that we should assume that we're gonna have $750,000 of free cash to balance the budget. It's just not realistic. If we do, we'll be maybe right there, and we'll just have $250,000 left, and that'll be it. So, at this stage in the process, I've reduced our free cash, contribution on the revenue side down to $650,000.
I think, I mean, even if we certify at $1.1 million instead of $1.2 million, right, or $1 million that you project, it still makes sense, right, to start to reduce that dependency by some amount.
And I think that's what we always
Whatever
talked
that
about,
amount
was to the
is.
greatest extent possible, when we can, it was originally meant to reduce the tax rate,
Of course.
but it was built into the budget, and so if we can back out our reliance on it, incrementally, we can when we should. So that's basically a net increase of all available revenues of $1 million. And the allowance for abatements, just as a reminder, this is something we talked about leading up to town meeting last year. We're looking to increase that. It's traditionally been at $135,000. Two reasons to increase it. The first is it's a reval year, so we're in our 5-year cycle this year. So you generally see increases in valuations, which helps the tax rate, and increases in abatements. So you need more in the overlay to cover those. That being said, we feel like we have incredibly accurate and up-to-date data, given the fact that we've just completed the measure and list process. So I think that's going to serve us well as we go through abatements. Nonetheless, I think making sure that we at least maintain the $135,000 in there is important. And then this coming spring now, town meeting approved putting a measure on the ballot to modify our senior circuit tax breaker program, which would increase eligibility from 8, 10, 12 residents that generally have been able to take advantage of that to something on the order of 75 or 80 residents. So it's going from the kind of 1% to 5% of our most vulnerable seniors. That being said, funding for that program has to come from somewhere, and it would come out of the overlay. So that's really the reason for the $35,000 increase in that allowance. That assumes that it will be approved at the ballot next spring, but it would impact us in FY20.
So it was 135 for abatements, and then plus the 35 for the credit, the circuit breaker?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's been 135 historically, and proposing to bump it up to 170.
So
Because we've had some capacity in the overlay, because the increase is going to be more than $35,000, but we've got some capacity in there, and that's
Right.
generally the number that we've talked about with the Board of Assessors.
And when do residents find if there was a change in the assessed value with the 4-year cycle kind of wrapping up? Would that be with estimated Q3?
This year?
Yeah.
No,
Or
it'll be next fiscal year.
And we can't really anticipate how many of those 5% seniors will take advantage of this program. So we've plugged numbers in there, but we really don't have an actual number yet.
Yeah, how we arrived at that number was that's the number of residents that were eligible and had taken advantage of the state's program. And our program is essentially mirroring the state's program in terms of eligibility standards,
Okay, got it. Thank you.
income eligibility.
This is probably maybe projecting out our thinking, that something that we don't have the information for, but on the Spring Hill project, is there any formulas that said if you build 15 houses or how many houses are up there, that will increase the number of students by X. And what will that cost be in 21, 22, 20, you know, kind of, how will that shift? Is it too soon to even think about that, or?
Yeah, I mean, we had this conversation when the Board of Selectmen was discussing the right of first refusal on you know, the Lakeview property. And you know, part of the reason why it ultimately ended up being age restricted, because of the concerns, the unknowns on the operating expense side. And there is some analysis that is out there that would give you some data points to base some projections off of. It was almost 3 years ago now, but my recollection is that all of them suffered from some biases in terms of they were geared towards looking at the value of housing, affordable housing production, or on the other side, looking at it through the school prism. So nothing that I know of that's a good measure to go off of.
If they're single-family homes with 3 to 4, 5 bedrooms, you could probably assume they're gonna have kids in them.
Kids, yes. The last time we attempted, and you'll remember this, I think, Jim, we attempted to look at a big project and estimate the number of students was Parsons Hill.
Oh,
And we woefully underestimated the number of students. And I think we probably at that time used something like, well, they have 4 bedrooms, most of them are probably gonna have 2 kids each, but not every house. So to Peter's point, unless the methodology has changed for doing that analysis, it's pretty tricky, and we've never been really accurate with it.
I think the other thing to keep in mind is we're one side of the equation. There's a lot of moving parts, obviously, over in Hamilton relative to, you know, the number of kids that could, you know,
And
be in the
also,
district.
as McKibben and others have noted, there's kind of a population trend in the region, or maybe across the country, of just less births,
Yeah.
which could lead to less kids.
Yeah.
And current enrollment declines too
Yeah.
are widespread.
Yeah, he did
So
something
how
on
many
his
units are in
presentation.
Spring Hill that are going in?
16 market rate?
15 or 13.
Thought it was 16 market rate, too
15.
affordable.
15.
15.
What total homes?
All market rate?
At Spring Hill?
Yeah.
No.
The 15
The
includes the affordable?
So,
no,
yes,
The
the
fif-
net 15 includes the affordables.
Right, because there was already,
2 houses there.
2 houses there.
2 houses will be remodeled.
right, so it's 17 units,
In the
2
development.
affordable, but
Right.
2 of the units were already there.
Is there
So it's net
is there a pretty wide range of the expected pricing, or are they all right in the same zone? Where they at?
2 or 4, I think, right now for pricing on the market.
Yeah.
But they're doing a lot of customized situations of like people coming in early. So it's hard for us even to project what we expect for building permit fees, because, you know, they're not looking to do as much of a cookie cutter as you'd think they are.
not on the inside anyway, probably.
Right.
Yeah,
Any other questions?
Private school, maybe.
You never know.
Yeah, that's right.
You don't ever know.
It's not unheard of.
That's another variable.
Yeah.
I didn't hear what you said.
Private
Private
school.
schools.
We
Wouldn't
do
be the
have-
first time.
We do have a few of them.
Right.
Yes.
So this slide's just basically an overview of what I covered in detail on the last slide.
Can you remind me what
Sure.
other department revenue, where that comes from? Is it like 30,000, 25, so it's 26,223 for FY 2020? On the revenue projection?
Yep. Nope. You're gonna stump me on that one.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
No,
Not-
I'm sorry, I
Well,
stopped.
If it
which one
was
are you asking about, so I know
The other department revenue.
when to ask the question?
It's not a, let's call
Oh,
Leslie.
Yeah, it's a relatively small one.
Yeah, it's not huge, I just couldn't remember from last year.
And I can't either.
She's got her first job.
That's right.
She can sleuth.
She's taking notes.
Finance director can figure that one out.
Special assessments obviously is our shared programs with
Yep,
Hamilton.
yep. Yeah, that's a bigger change.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions on the detail? Okay. So, bottom line, which is the last couple pages of the detail sheet, is that our estimated total revenues are just over $19 million. Our estimated appropriations are $19.8 million, so there's a structural deficit, as we've talked about, of just over $800,000. But then applying the $650,000 of free cash that our kind of starting position, if you will, for the FY20 budget process is in deficit by $150,000. Just to give,
Sorry,
Go ahead.
I'll let you finish.
I was just going to say, to give some context, going back to the FY19 budget process, when we started that last August, essentially the presentation was the structural deficit was 1.5 million. We were using $750,000 in free cash, and we had a deficit of $750,000. So, you know, the major ways that we got there is enrollment shift isn't as bad. We had additional capacity from the new growth that is obviously going to come in significantly higher. So those are the two major drivers that will give us a little more breathing room. And the school district also relied on less E&D last year, and so that also sets us up a little better.
But you're getting $1 million extra, and, sorry, not extra, but our revenues increased by $1 million. So even when I look at the other numbers, I'm still not understanding the big cost drive. Why there's still deficit? I see us coming close,
Yep.
but not even a deficit, so maybe I added up the numbers wrong.
Yeah, so,
Yeah.
I mean,
So
we
if I
gotta,
looked at the other charts that he did,
you're not getting 19.8 in
unless-
expenses and budgeted.
Unless I'm just not, because I looked at the other previous charts in terms of, not this one, the other ones that you had. Yeah,
Probably ties to something close to, is on your sheet, right?
and so I'm just looking at these numbers, which
Hope
I
so.
thought were the drivers.
Oh, there it is, actually.
that's,
Those are just percentage.
900.
what's that?
But the,
Those are plus over FY19, they're not total FY19.
Yeah, there's different
Right.
increases.
Right,
Yeah,
right. But I also got $1 million worth of revenue.
right, so that's $600,000 just on the schools. So our expenses are going up essentially just under 1.2 million, and our revenues are going up 1
So I
million.
took this chart and the previous chart, added them out. Of course, my numbers could be wrong. I come up to about 900, plus $1 million revenue. So I still thought we were close, under to the good or close.
And we're close. I mean, I think when I talk about the drivers on the town side,
Right,
these are all just high-level drivers. All the detail is in the sheet. And I don't, the $2, $5, $7, $8, $10,000 adds up incrementally.
Yeah.
towards the personnel side then. All right.
So, I mean, as you recall, we'll be going through every number with detail,
Yeah.
in detail with scrutiny.
I mean, I
I was just
I think, yeah.
concerned of what your next comment's gonna be.
so, Mike, if you look at the detail sheet, this,
Yes, ma'am?
if I look at the last page, under FY 2020 projected, on page 8, and I think this is meant to include literally line item by line item, that number of 19,813,135 for total expenses matches what Peter has
Yep.
in his presentation. So that's That's because there's more things than, I think, were just in that slide by apparently a significant amount of money.
And that's, why obviously I want the Finance Committee and Board of Selectmen to have this level of detail.
Right.
Because I've.
As we sleep with it under our pillow.
Yeah, wouldn't be helpful to go through it line by line,
No,
but the high level, also isn't necessarily fully reflective.
So you want us to feel good about the fact that we only have a $150,000 deficit going into the budget season? Is that the
It's all
message?
relative.
Well,
I'm kidding.
No, but I honestly,
Considering where we
given
were.
the fact of where we were starting last year's process
Yeah.
and what wasn't included in a lot of that initial budget, I think that, still the major unknowns of the enrollment shift that could go up or down, and that's really going to drive it significantly. But certainly, being on the backside of that is going to give us some real relief.
Cautiously optimistic.
Well, it makes you realize how much of a budget pressure that was once it starts to drop down. If there was no enrollment shift, we'd have a balanced budget.
But if,
Out of the gate. I mean, obviously, this is projections, which is very early on, subject to the process and everything else, but we would be we'd be starting at,
150 to be good, probably.
well, no, because the enrollment shift is $162,000. So we'd be right at,
Can the 3% for the schools, and I know it's totally early and so on, did the schools, refresh my memory, did the schools finish all their negotiations, contract negotiations last year?
those are still ongoing.
They're still ongoing. So did we, in that 3 points, did we assume kind of a 3-point adjustment in the contract?
So to go back to those conversations, the school administration represented us sitting around that very large table,
Yeah, I'm trying to remember that conversation.
that there was conservative but sufficient funding in the FY19 budget to account for wherever they thought they were going to end up for contract negotiations with the teachers and the unions. They're all on the same schedule, and generally the teachers complete their negotiations before the other bargaining units. So there should be enough money in the FY19, in the 19 budget, so that going into 20, they would follow the similar wage precedent. But again, those negotiations are still ongoing.
Have we heard any discussions or rumors about any significant capital, school capital stuff for the upcoming fiscal
There
year?
was
I mean, is
the,
the fields off the?
I don't know about the
discussions
fields,
and all those
but
kinds of
I
things?
do know that there have been discussions about the failed debt exclusion override and
Yeah.
rebranding, rethinking that. So I feel like, from what I've heard anyway, we can expect to see a debt exclusion override from the schools. What will be on it, how much it'll be, I don't know if Peter's heard anything more than I have, but
No.
I just feel like there will be a redo of that
There'll be a redo.
with,
So that 3% may not be adequate.
Well, no, because that would be a debt exclusion.
That'd be a debt
That
exclusion
would
out of
be-
the operating, right?
That would be
Okay.
totally separate.
Okay.
The real question
Yep.
for Wenham is whether the 5.4% increase was an aberration, or whether that's something that we're going to be seeing again this
Yeah,
year.
that's
There was
what-
the
It's-
level service budgets for 17 and 18.
Yeah.
That was not the case. We obviously had many conversations about that last year. But whether we're going to return to something on that order.
Yeah, big unknown still.
Yep.
Right, and potential upset would be the 3% placeholder here, to Peter's point, the 5.4. That was net, right, for us?
Yep.
No, 5.4.
That's gross.
We were not-
3.9,
we were
3.9 was net,
We were 9.2,
factor in
but that was
enrollment
with the
of
enrollment
9%.
shift.
Yeah.
The 5.4 was the gross.
Their
The
gross.
6.9 was the
Yeah.
reduction in E&D.
Right.
Oh,
The
But-
5.4 is what we need to see closer to 3% to be within these projected guidelines at this stage.
Yeah, I mean, just again, order of magnitude, if it was 5.4 again next year, then we would be $400,000 over. Every 0.5% is
Right.
$50,000. It's
Right.
pretty much exactly on the number.
Yeah.
And I guess this is pretty granular, but I guess we're assuming that that whatever they negotiate with the teachers, whenever, we're already in the fiscal year. I think their contract probably states that if they don't have a new contract, it just stays as it was. Not completely sure about that. But they could potentially have money in that budget that they've budgeted but are not spending because they don't have a contract yet unless they made it retroactive. And it only speaks to free cash, E&D.
E&D.
It doesn't speak to anything that they can really use.
Right, and I have actually, yeah.
Right.
I'd be
December-
surprised if they go through a whole nother fiscal year without settling their contracts, but I don't know, hard to say.
Hard to say. Another a little unknown.
Yes. So again, just a couple quick graphs. These should look familiar. FY15 was the first of 2 years that we applied the E&D that was released by the school district back to the two towns to the operating budget. Again, at the time, most of that was to reduce the tax rate, but it got baked in on the revenue side. And so basically, over the past 4 fiscal years now, we've maintained using one-time funding at the $750,000 level, and we're looking to step down by $100,000 for FY20, just based on where we expect free cash to end up from 19, or from 18, excuse me. Again, this is another chart that should look relatively familiar. It shows the projected FY20. So these are, again, budget figures for 16 through 19, projected for 20. And then the dollar change and the percentage change over the past 5 fiscal years. And again, the driver is, as you can see, on education for the most part in terms of what that increase has been, although I think I remember last year's percentage change where we ended up at the end of the budget process was closer to 32, 33%. So again, we're bending that curve back down as the enrollment shift drops off. And enrollment trends, again, plateauing over the past 2 fiscal years in particular. So it's really incremental changes that are projected right now from FY19 to FY20.
So the last 2 points on these lines are McKibben estimates? Or
just 20. FY19 is
sorry, that's
actual.
I meant per series.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
And not NASDAQ,
Correct.
but they're the same?
They're very similar. Wenham is the exact same. Hamilton, NASDAQ actually has Hamilton dropping a little more. But, you know, it's just a couple students. It's really not much difference at all.
Right. And we've got NASDAQ going back projections versus actual, which I know haven't been great all the time. And I forget, was this the first year that they selected McKibben for the, I mean, I remember the pitch they gave and the methodology and the like, but.
Yeah, so where we ended up pulling McKibben in from was they were engaged for the master plan that the district had done 5 years ago. And
That's right, there was some history of working with them.
yeah, and you know, my sense in reading that was that their methodology was a lot better than NASDAQ's, and so that was why they reached back out to McKibben.
Right, okay.
I've forgotten whether there's an expectation that they would continue using McKibben. in the future.
What McKibben agreed to was that they would do follow-up, projected actuals for the
Right.
next 2 fiscal years, but there wasn't necessarily any commitment to keeping them, engaged in an ongoing basis. I think it probably would be helpful to see how they do over the next 2 years, relative to their projections and where we end up. And again, this is a chart we've seen a fair amount over the past couple of years. Again, trending in the right direction in terms of getting on the right side of the enrollment shift. So it's really, the lowest it will have been in the past 5 fiscal years, and half of what we saw the past 3 fiscal years.
Right, right.
So, in terms of budget process and budget guidelines, because that was part of the conversation as well, the projections assume a level services budget, and, looking for, I think the select board will have this on their agenda next week to follow up with some discussion. But obviously, at this point, we do want to get going with the department heads on building their budgets, and want to give them some direction in doing so. I think probably a level services budget, again, makes sense, as we've done over the past several fiscal years, maintaining staffing levels, no major changes unless there's a really compelling reason to do so. I think as we work our way through the budget building process on town side, and the knowns or the unknowns become known on the school side, first enrollment, then E&D, and then finally the initial budget proposal from the superintendent. I think we have to, again, sort through, is it going to be the same policy position relative to an override that the town ended up taking last year, in terms of saying, this is how much we can afford. If there's anything over that, it's going to be a school operating override, or if that's going to be different this year. And then the last piece, and this is really a question that I had, just in terms of process, is whether it makes sense to have our department head presentations and kind of a follow-up presentation to the select board and the finance committee before or after we meet with Hamilton and the schools, presumably sometime in November. A case could be made on both sides, but I think something that we need to settle in on. A lot of it's probably going to be based on availability, trying to get everybody around the table for that meeting. I think, obviously, that's been the model the past several years, certainly as long as I've been here. I think that it would serve us well again this year, so that both Hamilton and certainly the schools understand where Wenham is relative to our levy limit before they really fully engage in their budget process.
Right.
So, is that a question we should start answering now?
Which?
The last one? If we wait until, if we do it too much before, I just remember last year, just because the school district is on a different budgeting timeline, and we were like up to the last minute before we were getting final numbers from
It's
them.
December.
Yeah.
Into
September
January.
and
So,
December, right?
that's an argument to meet a little bit later, although, advanced planning also helps, so I actually could go either way. But I'm almost leaning to later.
To the joint meeting, or to having the budget presentations with the department heads? I think my question is, do we want to know with real specificity where we are, having heard from our department heads before we engage with the schools? or would we rather give the schools some iteration of this overview and let them know we're working on our budget process, as they begin theirs, so.
And typically, we take the former approach, right? We have a pretty clear-cut view of where our budget is.
We have the past
Past couple of years
2
anyway.
years, just the way that we've approached it strategically,
Right.
and,
Well, I mean, I would expect that they're tuned in now, or will be, at least for this very preliminary stage, and I think it makes sense to express early where we think we are, but, I mean, to your point about, hearing from department heads and not, like, we don't need to front run it too much, because their schedule, to Carrie's point, is so different from ours, and it's so much later. We'll have, in a couple of months or less enrollment, free cash. When does school release their E&D? Relatively soon?
So they're,
We're banking on any, I'm just.
No, but we've put a placeholder, assuming they're not gonna have any.
Right, so, and a surprise to the upside last year.
Right.
Yep.
So generally, the timing is all late October, early November
Okay.
for certifying free cash on the town side, certifying E&D on the school side, and the enrollment figures certainly are confirmed, all at that time. So, that's why we have then historically met with the schools in Hamilton, in the, November timeframe. It's been it's been mid, late, and then beginning of October, just based on availability and other things.
Right.
Well, I think we'll have to add this to a selectmen's agenda, since we're not all here tonight.
Yeah.
But personally, I'll get ahead of my colleagues a little, just to say that I think maybe meeting with the department heads and I don't think the department heads will or should be changing their needs based on anything that's happening with the schools. So having as much information specified by our own department heads before we meet jointly with the schools in Hamilton seems like it makes sense.
Yeah, and I wasn't suggesting that,
No.
we would kind of adjust our,
No,
because,
no, 'cause you can't-
the
it's
schools,
independent.
that joint meeting is really for the schools to hear from the towns, as they've told us. That's what
Right.
we've done historically. They don't share much of anything in the way of what their operating budget or their capital plan is going to be. That's reserved for into the beginning, middle part of December, so. Okay. And that is all I have. I don't know if anybody has any other questions?
One quick one, so just, and we don't have to go back in slides, but the 200K on capital expenditure,
Yep.
that because of, I just want to make sure I understand this correctly, that's not like 200K off the capital improvement plan in terms of projects, knocking those off. It's more because they're one-time expenses, so we're really only budgeting for some capital needs of that 200 in the order of 50K or something like that, because of.
Yeah, I mean, it basically, what the $200,000 covers is about 150 of obligations which are known,
Yeah.
that we don't anticipate having another funding source for, free cash or otherwise, that
Okay.
we have to fulfill. And then there's really just a, $50,000 plug there for trying to address some other small capital needs that's on the CIP. And obviously, as part of the budget building process, we'll do a request out to the department heads to update the CIP, what's new and different, updated quotes, what's a are there new priorities, and so forth, and so that would be updated as part of that process.
Okay.
So again, it's just a, forecast, it's really a placeholder, but it's meant to reflect the fact that, we have these other obligations and we're gonna continue to, be committed to funding some level of our capital needs.
All right.
Great.
Thank you for the update.
Thank you.
It feels a little, well, a lot less daunting than last year, I guess, right? 150, I mean, it's not, we've still got a deficit here, and While it's prudent to mention, as you did, the potential policy implications of how we might structure or deal with another override, I, for one, have absolutely no expectation of delivering anything other than a balanced budget for FY '20. We
Good to know.
busted our butts last year. It was and we wore everyone out, ourselves and everyone else. That goes without saying, that's what we signed up for. And we'll do it again if need be, but we're gonna do it for a balanced budget. It's that simple, I think, so. Hopefully we'll get some good numbers firmed up and go from there.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Any other questions? I know that was our full agenda, so if not, anyone care to entertain a motion to adjourn? So moved.
Second.
All right, all in favor?
Sorry, I forgot to say it. I'm sorry.
Sign
No
language.
worries.
I'm sorry.
All in favor to adjourn?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you.
When do we meet again?
Thank you.